Good evening. Good evening. If you have a mobile phone, if you'd like to put it on silent, please, thank you. Tonight, as other worlds draw near, we have the mysterious Brian Halliwell with It's Only a Matter of Time. Brian addresses time and considers past, present and future. Is it always linear? Or can we revisit the past other than in our imagination? Or even a future? Is time just a part of a mathematics equation? Speed, distance and time? Or can we somehow sidestep our apparent time lock a little bit like Doctor Who? Let's have a look. Please welcome Brian Halliwell.
Thank you very much, Rob, and good evening. It's a pleasure to be back. In fact, I was here last week anyway, when Joanne came, and Joanne Hafford did the talk that she did on the counselling work that she does, and she did a great job, as we've just been discussing.
First talk, I didn't...
Oh yeah, first talk, and she did very well, and so that'll spur her on to do more. Well, it's a pleasure to come back and do this talk about time, really. And as Rob said there in the introduction, when anybody talks about time, and it's always a big subject, massive subject, complicated subject, but the all-important question is, which is at the end of the little introduction that's on the programme anyway, is the question that always asked is, can people travel in time? And that's always the question, can people travel in time? That's always seems to be uppermost when you talk about the subject of time. And if you believe the Philadelphia experiment, well, it's already been done, time travel, back in 1943. And I did 2 talks at Probe on this, and some of you might have been there. I did about 5 years ago, I did a part 1, and I did a part 2 the year after, and did a talk on the Philadelphia experiment here back in about 4 years ago, about 2012. We did it here about 2012. And just for those who are not fully initiated into the Philadelphia experiment, I mean, I'm going to mention it again a bit further along, but the Philadelphia experiment was a so-called experiment that took place in 1943 at the Naval Philadelphia Dockyards in Philadelphia, and it was an experiment, and the ship that was put down for the experiment was the Eldridge, the USS Eldridge, and the whole idea was to make the Eldridge invisible to enemy radar, enemy devices. So it was a wartime thing. That's what it was. It was just this naval experiment to make the ship invisible to enemy radar devices. That was the whole point of that exercise, the so-called experiment and exercise, if it took place. There's always been lots of debates over it, and anyhow, they rigged the ship up, they put all sorts of jennies, big powerful jennies on board, rigged it up, wired the ship round, and when they flicked the switch, all hell broke loose. Because in a blue flash of light, the ship vanished from the Philadelphia dockyard, and it turned up in Virginia a few seconds later, which is 200 miles away, and then in another blue flash of light, it vanished from Virginia and finished up back in Philadelphia. So in other words, it did the round trip of about 400 miles in seconds or minutes. And then this electric field, this magnetic field that they created got unstable. And then the ship then, according to all the stories and the legends, then moved through into the past, into the future, different time periods. And it's a great story. There's an enthralled people for years. And we talked about this 4 years ago here, for the ones who were here. And it's a great story, the Philadelphia experiment of 1943. So in other words, if you believe that, then time travel has already been done back then during the war years. So what does science say about all this? Well, science has no qualms about anybody moving a one-way move into the future, because we all do it anyway. Because as we live our lives, we move into the future every day. Every second that passes, we're moving into the future. So that's to exist as a human being. We move into the future. So science has no argument about that. Yes, we are moving into the future as we live our lives. And when we talk about Albert Einstein and the theory of relativity, the famous theory of relativity, he always stated in that theory, and that theory showed that we can and we could travel faster into the future, faster than ordinary living conditions would prevail, and we all know how that is achieved by, in other words, as the theory of relativity stated, by travelling in a spaceship at almost light speed. In other words, 186,000 miles a second, and if you travel in a spaceship through the universe for about 12 months at almost the speed of light and return back to Earth, you'd find that many years have passed on Earth while you've hardly aged. In other words, in other words, the thing that came out of that theory was time slows down the faster you go. And that's not a theory, that is fact. Because when Einstein brought out his theory of relativity way back in 1905, and that was stated about time slowing down, it was proved very shortly after by atomic clocks. So that is not a theory, that is fact. Time slows down the faster you go. So in other words, even if you're flying on a plane, if you're just flying to Spain or flying to Australia, your time slows down for you relative to the people back on land, back on Earth. But it's so negligible, travelling at ordinary speeds, that really it's just not worth even considering. The key factor here, which you can't help but stress, is the fact that to see the noticeable time dilation, you need to be travelling light speed or towards light speed. And I know there's lots of problems if you could even approach that speed of 186,000 miles a second, physical problems regarding even getting to that speed. But ignoring all that, the key factor is you'd have to travel at almost light speed to see the effect. So in other words, if our intrepid space traveller was travelling at almost the speed of light, say about 0.9% the speed of light, and he travelled around the universe for about a year, and then came back to Earth, he would find that all his friends and relatives are long dead while he's almost the same age. So in other words, when we look at this scenario, this must be a great scenario for anybody thinking, I would like to see the Earth in about 1,000 years' time, or 5,000 years' time, to see what it would look like in 5,000 years' time. So in order to do that, I suppose all you could do is calculate, depending on the speed you're going to travel at, whether it's 0.8, 0.85 or 0.9% the speed of light, then you'd also just calculate the time dilation effect that would have at the speed you're travelling, and then that would be able to, you'd be able to calculate how long you would need to be away, so that when you arrive back on Earth 5,000 years in the future or 10,000 years in the future. So I suppose that is one way of doing it, by that time dilation effect. And that is a fact of life now, the time dilation effect. So in other words, that was an offshoot of the theory of relativity. And in time, really time has just about fascinates everybody because it dominates our life for a start off. I mean, we can't help but be dominated by time, because we have a time to get up, a time to go to work, time to come home, and most of us wear a watch, and even the ones who don't wear watches and think I'm not dominated by time, you really are dominated by time, because everything you do, you've got to just check on the time. Coming here to listen to a lecture, if you're not here for about 8 to 10 past 8, you're going to miss it. So everybody is conditioned by time. So we're all dominated by it in various ways. And again, this time travel idea. And really, everybody's been fascinated by time travel, and in my view, ever since H.G. Wells published his famous book, The Time Machine, back in 1895. And I think that just about paved the way for every other time travel story and film ever since he published that in 1895. Made him famous, made him rich, and he wrote loads of other books, but The Time Machine is the one that he was famous for. And again, you can read it again because it's now reprinted in the shops. Again, goes through ultimate reprints. It's all back in the shops now, all H.G. Wells books, and The Time Machine is there again. And I read that when I was in my teens. And The Time Machine book, our hero in The Time Machine, he travels thousands of years into the future and meets this funny ancient race. It's a great story. And of course they made the films. And arguably, the film that they made in 1960 with Rod Taylor, some people say that's the best one, and it is a good one, and it's always on the television. But I like the remake they did a few years ago. I think Guy Pearce played the time traveller, and that's a good version. A few more special effects, and that is a good one. So The Time Machine, H.G. Wells' great story, just about spawned every other story and film ever since. But there's lots of others. Somewhere in Time. Has anybody ever heard of that one? 1980. And I was talking to somebody the other week about that. Somebody mentioned it to me, and it's a great film. It's a great film. Christopher Reeve is in that, in other words, Superman. Jane Seymour. And it's just a simple story about this playwright who finds a way of going back in time and to meet a long-lost girlfriend that he loved and lost, and then he can meet her again and carry on the affair, so to speak. Even though it's a romantic film, it's a great film, and it's easy to watch. But to me, all the films I have seen on time travel, to me, the greatest one is that one there. And I brought this now because when I was doing this talk at Preston New Horizons a while ago, people were saying, what's that film again? What's that film? And there it is, The Portrait of Jenny. Has anybody ever heard of that film? 1948. Hollywood, great film. In other words, Joseph Cotton, Jennifer Jones, Ethel Barrymore, one of the Hollywood great films of 1948. Always used to be on the television. My mum and dad used to watch it, and I used to watch it very rarely on now. But it's a great film, and that's a great film. And it was they made the film from the book that was written by Robert Nathan, and I've got that book. It's only very thin, but it's a great book and it's a great story. And the portrait of Jenny, and I know since I've done this talk a few times, lots of people have gone and got the film, because it's a weird story. It's a weird story about this penniless artist who meets this young, strange girl who seems to age every time he meets her. Every time he sees her, she's got a bit older all the time. And it's strange. And anyhow, these two fall in love with each other, only for the penniless artist to find out that really she's been dead for years, but eventually she comes to life again during a storm at sea, very similar to a storm that she once perished in when she died the first time round. But it's a great haunting story, and it discusses all the aspects of the time problem or the time subject. So for 1948, it's a great film, and there was a great introduction to it, and I've brought the introduction because I wrote it down, because to me it encapsulates everything we're going to talk about on this subject. And this was the introduction in the book and in the film, and it just about says it all to me. And this is what it said for 1948. Since the dawn of time, man has looked into the awesome reaches of infinity and asked the eternal questions. What is life and what is death? What is space and what is time? Through 100 civilizations, philosophers and scientists have come together with answers, but bewilderment remains. Science tells us that nothing ever dies, but only changes, and time itself does not, but curves around us, and that the past and the future are together at our side forever. And Jenny's song, the portrait of Jenny's song, in that, where I come from nobody knows, and where I am going everything goes. And she sings that in the film, and it's a haunting film. And for £5 or £6 at HMV or Amazon, well worth the spend to get that classic film, very rarely on the television. And what an introduction to the book and the film. And I always think to myself, wouldn't it be great if we could do it like the films, travel into the future like the books and films. It's all right doing Einstein's theory of relativity, where you've got to travel at almost the speed of light, but obviously none of us can do that. But in the theory, that would be great to do it. But it would be great to do it like in the books and films. And when people talk about the Philadelphia experiment, and I've done numbers of talks on that, and other examples of time travel, before you know it, all the skeptics come out in droves and say impossible. It's rubbish. It's all hoaxes. And the Philadelphia experiment has suffered from that as well. People going, it's all a hoax, it's all rubbish, it never happened. And that's what everybody says about it. You form your own opinion about the Philadelphia experiment and other stories about time travel. But people say it's rubbish. Is it rubbish? When I was doing the second talk at Probe 4 years ago, 5 years ago, a lady came up to me who comes to this group. She's not been here for a while, and she came up to me after the talk at Probe, and she said there was an article in a magazine that she's just read. She said, it was very interesting, Brian, I'll send it to you. And she did, and I can only thank the lady for sending me that article. And it was about a bloke, and I have mentioned this in the past here, it was about a bloke in America who built a time machine in Kansas City in 1998. And it was a great article. And this bloke in America in 1998, he built himself a time machine. And what it was just a time portal, and it was a massive array of wires, all connected to two vertical cylinders inside a rotating magnetic field. It was about 35 foot high, and when he switched it on, there was about 3 million volts surging through the wires. He built himself a platform of about 25 foot high, overlooking the machine. And even in the article in the magazine, it also mentions all the other experiments he did with smaller objects, but that's just by the by. But anyway, the big experiment came along. He built this platform, he stood on the top of it, he pulled the switches, 3 million volts surged through the wires, and he created an event horizon in his vertical cylinders, which he built 25 foot below. He could see it shimmering, and he thought, to hell with it, and he jumped in. He jumped in and he disappeared. When he woke up in a field in Ohio. He hadn't a clue where he was, but he woke up in this field, and it all turned out this field that he came round in, lucky to be alive I suppose, he came round in this field, and it all turned out to be 800 miles away from the warehouse in Kansas City where he built his time machine and jumped in. 800 miles away. And it all turned out where he built that machine and jumped in 1998. It was now the year 2000. So this American intrepid inventor had somehow moved 800 miles through space, 800 miles through space to this field in Ohio and moved 2 years in time. He had no idea how he did it. He just jumped in, vanished, and he thinks he moved through some sort of hyperspace. And that's what he probably did. Anyhow, the job was he had to get back to Kansas City to look at his warehouse to check on his time machine. When he arrived back in Kansas City, the warehouse was empty. The machine had gone. Because where he'd only been away for a short time, the people who knew he was building this contraption, a machine, suddenly realised that he's vanished, he's not turned up again, so they probably thought he's not coming back, probably dismantled it and sold up bits for scrap and what have you. So in other words, this brilliant time machine that he said he built had gone. So anyhow, the article tells us that he went on the American radio, he was interviewed talking about this great experiment that he built, this time machine, and the article concluded where he was doing odd jobs in various factories trying to raise up enough money to be able to build his time machine again. The end of the article, that was it. Nobody's any idea. I have no idea whether he managed to build another or whether he's in the process of building another one. But he said he had moved, believe it or not, 800 miles through space, and he'd moved into the future 2 years. So if the Philadelphia experiment is true, and if this experiment is true, that this man in America said he built a time machine in 1998 and moved into the future, that would suggest that a future event has already happened, and maybe the future is fixed and decided. It's only a view, but that's what you start to think about if these stories are true. I was reading about a German poet, famous German poet, and he wrote an autobiography. And he said in this autobiography about the time when he was a young bloke and he was driving back from his girlfriend's house, and he was driving down the Strasbourg road when he suddenly saw his double driving towards him in a similar car. And he thought, God, that looks like me. And this double was dressed in a grey and gold jacket and suit. And he thought, that's just like me. What a weird experience that is. And anyway, 8 years later, when he was driving down that road where this double was driving round, he suddenly thought, hey, this is that spot where I had that moment where I saw my double 8 years before, and realised he was now wearing a gold and grey suit. So in other words, he concluded that somehow he had seen his double 8 years before driving down the road. So he realised that that implies predestination of some sort, that he was destined to see his future self. That's what he wrote in his book. I've somehow seen my future self. So in other words, that would suggest that a future event has somehow happened. I did a talk here a few years ago about synchronicity. Some of you might remember it. It's a good while ago now. Carl Jung stuff. Is anybody familiar with Carl Jung stuff? Synchronicity and all the rest of that? Anybody familiar with that? We did the talk here a few years ago. There were about 60 turned up. You were there, Rob. I'm sure you were. Cracking night. And great stuff. Carl Jung's theories on synchronicity. But I read another book of his, and he was talking about when he was a young bloke, just a young bloke as a student, and all the students who were studying the same stuff as he was studying, one night they're in a tavern having a few beers and discussing dream therapies and dream stuff, and all this was part of the studies. And one lad, while they were having a beer, was describing a dream he'd had the previous night. And he described to the group that he dreamt that he was stood in a Spanish city on a street corner, and he was looking at a Gothic cathedral, and he realised he wanted a closer look to get a real good glimpse of this. So he decided to cross the road and go and have a look. And as he tried to cross the road, suddenly a coach and horses went speeding past, big fancy coach, white horses went speeding past. So he had to stay there until it passed, and then he could cross. And he was telling this to the group, and then a few years later, when he passed all his exams, his father decided to treat him and said, you can go anywhere you want abroad as a bit of a treat because you pass your exams. So the lad decided to go to Spain. So you know what's coming. He went to the city in Spain, found himself stood on that corner looking at the Gothic church, and decided to go and have a closer look. And as he tried to cross the road, a coach and horses went speeding past. Big fancy coach, white horses went streaming past.